Picture this. A winter storm knocks out power to half a state, and while millions of people sit in the dark waiting for a utility crew, one household 2 counties over never even noticed the outage happened. Their lights stayed on, their fridge kept running, their well pump kept pulling water. That family wasn't using some secret military technology. They were using energy methods that are over a century old, techniques so effective at breaking dependence on the grid that in many places today they're heavily restricted. Buried under permit requirements, zoning ordinances, and emissions rules that conveniently make them expensive or difficult to set up legally. I'm not talking about anything dangerous or illegal here. I want to be completely clear about that up front. I'm talking about 3 real, historically documented energy systems that regular people use successfully for generations, systems that utility companies and local governments have made progressively harder to install as grid dependence became more profitable for everyone except the homeowner. Today I'm walking you through exactly what these 3 methods are, the real history behind each one, why regulations tightened around them, and how you can still legally use versions of them on your own property with the right permits and planning. Stick around, because the last one has a World War II history that most people have never heard. During World War II, when Nazi occupation and Allied blockades cut off gasoline supplies across much of Europe, an estimated 1 million vehicles were converted to run on wood gas instead of petroleum fuel. The technology was called a gasifier, and the most widely used design was developed by French engineer Georges Imbert in the 1920s. Here's how it actually worked. Wood chips or charcoal were loaded into a sealed chamber and burned with a restricted low oxygen supply, a process called pyrolysis. Instead of producing a clean flame, this partial combustion generated a combustible gas mixture rich in carbon monoxide and hydrogen, commonly called syngas or producer gas. That gas was then cooled, filtered through cloth or straw to remove tar and particulates, and piped directly into a modified internal combustion engine, which burned it almost exactly like gasoline. Countries including Sweden, Germany, and France ran buses, trucks, tractors, and even small home generators on this exact principle. After the war ended and cheap oil flooded back into the market, wood gasification essentially vanished from public memory, but the technology never disappeared. Today, small-scale gasifier generators exist and work on the same basic pyrolysis principle, capable of running standard generator engines using nothing but dried wood chips, corn cobs, or other biomass. Here's why you don't see them everywhere. The Environmental Protection Agency regulates emissions from combustion generators under the Clean Air Act, and many states require specific certification for any generator producing particulate emissions above certain thresholds, which most improvised gasifiers exceed without proper filtration systems. Building or operating one for personal use on private property is generally legal in most jurisdictions, especially for non-continuous emergency backup power. But selling units commercially or running them continuously often triggers state air quality permitting requirements. If you want to explore this legally, look into EPA-compliant gasifier kits designed for off-grid homesteads, which include proper tar filtration and emissions, scrubbing that keeps you compliant while still giving you fuel independence from the gas station entirely. Long before anyone had heard the word hydroelectric, farms and mills across America and Europe ran entirely on falling water. The technology dates back over 2,000 years, with Greek engineer Philo of Byzantium documenting water wheel designs as early as 240 BCE, and by the Middle Ages, England's Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, recorded over 5,600 water mills operating across the country. The principle is beautifully simple. Moving water turns a wheel, the wheel turns a shaft, and that mechanical energy either grinds grain directly or, in modern applications, spins a generator to produce electricity. A properly designed micro-hydro system on even a small stream, with just a few feet of elevation drop, can generate a continuous round-the-clock electrical output that solar panels simply cannot match, because unlike sunlight, flowing water doesn't stop at night or during cloudy weeks. So why isn't every rural property running one? The answer is water rights law, and it's more complicated than most people expect. In many Western states operating under prior appropriation doctrine, established through court cases dating back to the California Gold Rush era of the 1850s. The water flowing across your land may legally belong, in terms of usage rights, to someone else entirely, sometimes a downstream farm or municipality with historical water claims. Diverting or impounding that water without proper permitting can trigger real legal consequences. Eastern states generally operate under riparian rights doctrine, which is more permissive for landowners adjacent to a waterway, but even there, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission requires licensing for hydro systems that meet certain size thresholds. Though most residential micro-hydro setups under 100 kilowatts qualify for simplified small conduit exemptions. The practical path forward is contacting your state's Department of Natural Resources before installing anything, confirming your specific water rights classification, and in many cases you'll find that a small, low-impact run-of-river system, one that doesn't dam or significantly alter stream flow, qualifies for a straightforward permit specifically because it returns the water downstream essentially unchanged. Wind power has an even older lineage than water wheels, with Persian windmills documented in the region of Sistan, dating back to around 500 to 900 CE, using vertical axis designs to grind grain and pump water in an area with almost no rainfall but consistent seasonal winds. American farms adopted wind power aggressively in the late 1800s, and by the 1930s, an estimated 6 million small wind electric systems, popularly known by brand names like Windcharger, were installed on farms across the rural United States, specifically because federal electrification programs hadn't reached them yet. Once the Rural Electrification Administration, created in 1935, extended power lines to nearly every American farm by the 1950s, home wind turbines largely disappeared, not because they stopped working, but because connecting to the grid became mandatory in many contracts and cheaper in the short term. Today, a well-placed small wind turbine on a rural property can realistically supplement or in some cases fully replace grid electricity, particularly in consistently windy regions of the Great Plains, the Midwest, and coastal areas. So what stops people from installing them? Two major obstacles, and neither is really about the technology itself. First, homeowners association covenants in many suburban, and even some rural developments explicitly prohibit any structure exceeding certain height limits, and residential wind turbines typically need to reach 30 to 100 feet to access consistent, turbulence-free wind, well above what most HOA bylaws allow. Second, the Federal Aviation Administration requires notification and sometimes obstruction lighting for any structure over 200 feet near flight paths, and local zoning boards frequently impose their own height restrictions modeled after cell tower ordinances, sometimes capping private structures at 35 feet regardless of purpose. The workaround most successful off-grid homesteaders use is researching county-level zoning specifically, since counties often have far more permissive rules than incorporated towns or HOA-governed subdivisions, and many states have passed right-to-farm or renewable energy easement laws in the last 2 decades specifically protecting small agricultural wind installations from restrictive local ordinances. Here's the pattern worth noticing across all 3 of these technologies. None of them are inherently dangerous when built and operated correctly, and none of them were originally regulated out of genuine safety concern for the average small-scale user. What happened instead was a slow accumulation of regulation, originally designed for industrial-scale operations, gradually applied to residential setups almost as an afterthought. Clean Air Act emissions standards were written primarily targeting factories and large diesel generators, not a homesteader running a small wood gasifier twice a month during outages. Water rights law, dating back to 19th century mining disputes, was never designed with a family wanting to generate 2 kilowatts from a backyard creek in mind. And HOA height restrictions were largely written to prevent unsightly satellite dishes and antenna towers in the 1980s and 90s, decades before compact residential wind turbines became a realistic option for suburban acreage. The result is a regulatory landscape that technically allows most of these systems with proper permitting, but makes the process confusing enough that most people simply give up and stay connected to the grid, paying monthly bills for something they could partially or fully generate themselves. This isn't a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It's simply what happens when old laws never get updated for new applications, and utility companies, understandably protective of their revenue model, have little incentive to help you navigate around them. Knowing the actual history and the actual legal pathways changes that equation completely. If any of these three methods caught your attention, here's the honest starting point for each. For wood gasification, look into small-scale gasifier kits marketed for off-grid backup power. Verify EPA tier compliance if your state requires it for stationary generators. And start with intermittent emergency use rather than continuous operation to stay well within most residential regulatory frameworks. For micro-hydro, contact your state's natural resources or environmental protection department first, before buying any equipment, to determine your specific water rights classification and whether your stream qualifies for simplified small conduit hydropower exemptions. For wind, start by pulling your county zoning ordinance rather than assuming HOA rules apply, since agricultural and rural zoned land frequently allows structures your suburban neighbor legally cannot install. All three of these systems share the same underlying truth. They worked reliably for previous generations without a power grid at all, and the knowledge never disappeared. It just got buried under paperwork most people never bothered reading. If this opened your eyes to options you didn't know existed, subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment telling me which of these three you'd actually try on your own property, and share this with someone who's tired of watching their power bill climb every single year.